Imagine living your entire life in a single room, where cooking, sleeping, arguing, and surviving all happen within the same four walls. Now picture sharing that tiny space with your parents, your children, and even the animals that kept you alive. Chapter 1. The cottage itself. 4 walls, 1 life picture, a home no bigger than a modern single-car garage, except instead of holding tools and storage boxes, it must contain an entire world. A one-room cottage was not just a dwelling. It was a kitchen, a workshop, a bedroom, a pantry, a nursery, and a barn, all squeezed into a single dim space. Most cottages were built from whatever the land offered. Rough timber if you lived near forests, mud and straw if trees were scarce, stone if the hills were generous. Nothing. It matched, nothing was symmetrical, and nothing was straight. The walls bowed, the beams creaked, and the roof sagged like a tired old man. But it kept the rain off, and that was enough. Step inside and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Not unpleasant, just alive. Smoke drifting from the open hearth, damp earth packed into the floor, the faint sweetness of last year's thatch above your head, the sharper scent of animals, because in winter, even the family goat or pig might sleep inside for warmth. You may even catch a hint of yesterday's stew simmering in a pot that never truly leaves the fire. And light? That was a luxury. A single tiny window, if the family was lucky enough to afford one, barely allowed the sun to push through. Most cottages relied on the open door during the day, letting in cold air and flies along with the light. Shadows clung to the corners, making the room feel smaller than it already was. The hearth dominated everything. It sat at the center of life, the literal heart of the cottage. Here, food was cooked, hands were warmed, tools were dried, gossip was shared, and children were scolded. The fire burned from dawn until long after dusk, because without it, there was no warmth, no meals, and no comfort. Around the walls you'd find the few treasured possessions a family owned. A pot, a few wooden bowls, heirloom spoons, a spindle for wool, a chest for clothing, maybe a crude bench or table. Everything had a purpose. Everything had to earn its place. Now look up. The rafters aren't just structural, they're storage. Herbs hang from the beams, drying for winter. Strips of meat or fish might dangle above the hearth, preserved by the constant smoke. Spare tools, ropes, and baskets are tucked into the overhead shadows. Even the rafters were part of the home's nervous system. The sleeping area was usually pushed against the farthest wall, opposite the door where the cold wind blew in. The parents might have a small straw mattress, stuffed, with hay or rushes, covered in whatever fabric they could manage, coarse wool if they were fortunate. Children slept on thinner pallets or directly on blankets laid across the floor. Privacy was non-existent. Intimacy had to be quiet, careful, or simply accepted as a fact of life by every soul in the room. Even the door told a story. Many early cottages didn't have metal hinges or locks. A simple wooden bar or rope held it closed. Some doors were so small you had to crouch to enter. This wasn't a design choice, but a strategy to keep heat inside and keep large animals or thieves out. Outside, the walls were often patched with whatever could be found. Mud slapped into gaps, stones wedged under beams, straw jammed into cracks to stop the winter wind. A cottage always looked slightly unfinished, because it always was. Repairs never stopped, age never paused. Homes were living things, constantly shifting under the weight of seasons, storms, and the daily needs of the family inside. Yet for all its cramped discomforts, this single room was a sanctuary. A place of stories, laughter, quarrels, and survival. Here children took their first steps. Here families mourned and celebrated. Here life unfolded, hour by hour, in the glow of a flickering hearth. But if the cottage itself was a challenge, imagine what it was like to wake up each morning inside it, cold, smoky, and instantly demanding your attention. Chapter 2. Morning rituals, waking to smoke, cold, and chores. Before dawn breaks, the one-room cottage is still wrapped in darkness, a heavy, smoky kind of darkness that clings to the rafters and settles into every blanket. The fire, the heart of yesterday's life, has burned down to nothing but dull embers. And in that moment, before anyone stirs, the cottage is at its coldest. Then comes the first sound of the day, someone coughing. It's usually the mother or whoever is the earliest riser. She pulls herself from her straw mattress, stiff from a night spent breathing in wood smoke and winter air. Her breath turns white the moment she exhales. The room is freezing, the floor is dirt. And her first task is the same every single morning: bring the fire back to life. She crouches by the hearth, blowing gently on the embers, feeding them with twigs kept dry under the bench. Sparks jump, crackle, and finally give in. A thin ribbon of flame curls up, and instantly the room shifts. The crackle of fire becomes a quiet invitation. The day has begun. Slowly, the rest of the family stirs. Children groan and stretch on their stiff sleeping pallets. One may still be wrapped in a wool blanket, shivering against the morning chill. Another rubs their eyes as the smoky air stings them awake. There was no such thing as sleeping in. The day didn't care if you were tired. Animals needed feeding, water needed collecting, bread needed kneading, life demanded motion. Before anything else, the door is opened to let the smoke escape, and in rushes more cold air. A rooster crows outside, a goat bleats, frost crunches under bare feet if it's winter, and mud sucks at the ground if it's spring. Morning was not gentle in the medieval countryside. It was a slap of reality. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was a process. First, yesterday's bread is gathered. It's hard now, nearly rock-like, but that's normal. Fresh bread was a luxury saved for rare moments. The mother softens it by warming it near the hearth or dipping it in warm milk if they have any left. A pot of thin porridge might simmer on the fire. Oats or barley mixed with water, maybe flavored with a pinch of salt, rarely sweetened. Honey was precious, reserved for illness or special occasions. While breakfast warms, chores begin. The father steps outside to check the animals. Chickens need grain scattered. The goat or cow must be milked. Sometimes a child accompanies him, carrying a wooden bucket too big for their hands. Milking is a quiet, rhythmic task, important, steady, and essential. The warm milk, steaming in the cold air, feels like a small victory. Inside, older children help with the morning tasks. One fetches water from the nearest stream or well, balancing a wooden pail as best they can. Another sweeps the dirt floor with a bundle of twigs tied into a broom. Dust rises in tiny clouds. The cottage smells of earth, smoke, and sleep. The mother tends to the fire, adjusts the pot, and begins preparing dough if the family plans to bake that day. Baking wasn't a casual thing. It was a commitment. Dough had to rise near the warm hearth, covered in cloth, protected from cold drafts that could ruin it. Meanwhile, the younger children, still waking up, huddle near the fire. Their hair is messy, their faces smudged with sleep, and their clothes rumpled from being worn day and night. They warm their hands and watch the flames dance. Those moments, quiet and simple, may have been the closest thing to comfort the morning offered. Depending on the season, the family might gather wild herbs, repair tools, or prepare for planting or harvesting. Mornings were not about ease or leisure. They were about building enough momentum to survive the rest of the day. Breakfast itself is eaten quickly. Sitting on stools, benches, or the floor, the family eats together. There is no table set with plates, just shared bowls, shared spoons, shared hands. The food fills the stomach, if nothing else. Conversation is minimal, often replaced by the sounds of scraping bowls and crackling fire. By mid-morning, the cottage feels fully awake. Warmth spreads slowly, light filters in through the tiny window, illuminating. Chapter 3. Work, Food, and Survival. Living by Hand. If mornings in a one-room cottage were busy, the rest of the day was a test of endurance. Survival wasn't something that happened automatically. It was carved out of the hours with aching muscles and calloused hands. Every task, every bite of food, every moment of warmth had to be earned through labor. The sun barely clears the horizon before the day truly begins. By now, the family has eaten their simple breakfast, tended the animals, and rekindled the fire. The cottage, small, smoky, and crowded, empties as the work spills outward into the fields, the yard, and the world beyond the doorway. For the father and older sons, the day might begin with fieldwork. If it's spring, they plow. If it's summer, they weed. If it's fall, they harvest. And if it's winter, well, winter is a different kind of enemy. Winter steals crops, freezes soil, and forces the family to rely on whatever they manage to store. But regardless of the season, the work never truly stops. Plowing, for example, was an exhausting dance of man, beast, and stubborn earth. A wooden plowshare digs into the soil, while an ox, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, drags it forward. If not, human strength must do the job. Mud clings to boots, blistered hands grip the rough handles, and every inch of progress feels like an accomplishment. Back at the cottage, the mother's day is equally demanding. She becomes the engine of the home, the manager of food, fire, children, and chores. Grinding grain is a daily ritual. With a quernstone, she pours dried barley or wheat into the top and turns the heavy upper stone by hand, grinding it into coarse flour. The motion is repetitive, almost hypnotic, but it demands strength and time. The sound of grinding becomes part of the cottage's soundtrack. Food preparation fills much of her day. Every meal requires planning and effort. There is no pantry stocked with choices, only what the family has grown, bartered for, or preserved. A pot of stew might simmer for hours, made from root vegetables, a handful of herbs, and maybe on a lucky day, a small piece of fat or meat. The smell curls through the cottage, giving children something to look forward to. They help too. Children weren't idle, they were small workers in training. A 5-year-old might gather kindling. An 8-year-old might scare birds from the crops or help weed the garden. A 10-year-old could carry buckets of water, mend fences, or help with the animals. Childhood was short, not because anyone wanted it to be, but because the family needed every set of hands it had. Some days are spent preserving food for winter, smoking meat above the hearth, drying herbs in bunches hung from the rafters, salting fish if the village lies near a river. These tasks are tedious, but life-saving. A harsh winter could be deadly if the family's stores ran low. Inside the cottage, the space shifts to match the work. A single room becomes a bakery when dough is kneaded on a wooden board. It becomes a workshop when tools are repaired. It becomes a craft room when wool is spun on a spindle or woven on a small loom. The mother's hands move constantly, stirring, sewing, spinning, patching, teaching. Even the children's toys emerge from this world of necessity, a carved wooden animal, a bundle of rags sewn into a doll, or a hoop made from a bent branch. Imagination did the rest. Meals are small, but meaningful breaks in the rhythm. A midday meal might consist of bread, cheese if the goat has been generous, a bit of vegetable stew, or leftover porridge. They eat quickly, not because they want to rush, but because time is precious. The sun dictates their schedule, and daylight cannot be wasted. As the afternoon wears on, fatigue settles into everyone's limbs. Yet the work continues. Tools must be cleaned. Animals must be checked again. Firewood must be gathered before the sun dips too low. The cottage's limited space means everything must be used, repaired, reused, or repurposed. Waste is a luxury no one can afford. And when the sun finally begins to sink, shadows stretching long across the fields, evening brings new tasks, quieter tasks, yes, but still necessary. Because nightfall in a one-room cottage brings its own challenges. And in Chapter 4, we step into the intimate, crowded, and surprisingly fragile world of family life after dark, where privacy disappears, stories come alive. Chapter 4. Family Life and Nightfall. Privacy was a luxury. As the sun sinks behind the hills, the cottage undergoes its daily transformation. The bright, bustling workspace of daylight becomes a dim, intimate world of flickering firelight. Shadows stretch across the walls, and the sounds of labor, axes chopping, oxen snorting, children laughing outside, fade into the quiet of evening. But life doesn't slow because people are tired. Evening in a one-room cottage is simply the beginning of a different kind of work. The mother tends the hearth first. The fire is fed carefully, never too much because wood is precious, but enough to light the room and warm the air. The glow paints everyone's faces in shades of gold and orange. The pot that has simmered all afternoon is stirred. The smell of stew, simple but comforting, fills the room. For many families, this was the best moment of the day. Children, still buzzing from the leftover energy of daylight chores, gather near the hearth. Their cheeks are flushed from the cold. and their clothes smell faintly of smoke and soil. They sit close enough to the fire to feel warmth on their skin, but not so close that they risk being burned. It is the cottage's unspoken rule. Fire kept you alive, but you respected it like a living creature. Dinner is humble. Wooden bowls are filled with ladles of stew, carrots, leeks, onions, maybe a few pieces of barley or turnip. On a lucky day, a sliver of meat might have been added. Bread is passed around, hard on the outside, softer near the middle. Everyone eats with gratitude. Hunger was a familiar visitor, and no one took a full belly for granted. As they eat, conversation begins. Not formal, not planned. Just the gentle talk of people who spend every waking moment together. Children talk about the chickens they chased, or the strange bug they found near the well. The father might report how the fields look, whether the soil is too dry or too wet. The mother reminds everyone to repair their socks before winter fully arrives, or she might pass around a handful of berries she saved for the evening. It's in these moments, cramped as the cottage may be, that warmth grows, not from the fire, but from family. After dinner, the cottage becomes a workshop again. The father sharpens tools using in whetstone, the rhythmic scraping echoing softly. The mother spins wool, her spindle twisting and dropping in a practiced, graceful motion. Older children help mend clothes, awkwardly threading needles with small, clumsy fingers. Younger children sit nearby, listening to the adults' conversations and absorbing the skills they will need one day. And then, there's storytelling. Before books, before lanterns, before the luxury of spare time, storytelling was how families bonded and passed down knowledge. The father might recount tales from his own childhood, harsh winters, old superstitions, stories of traveling traders with exotic items. The mother might share folklore, spirits in the forest, fairies who blessed crops, cautionary tales meant to keep children safe. These stories were entertainment, education, and memory, all woven together. But as the night deepens, fatigue settles over the room. The fire dims to a softer glow. The wind outside hums against the thatch. A rooster calls out once before remembering it's not yet dawn. The cottage begins its nightly ritual, turning one room into many beds. The parents' sleeping space is usually the most comfortable. A raised straw mattress against the wall farthest from the drafty door. The children sleep on smaller pallets or directly on blankets spread across the floor. Straw rustles as everyone settles in. The smell of wool blankets, dried herbs, and lingering stew merges into a familiar nighttime fragrance. Privacy is non-existent. Every breath, every whisper, every movement is shared. A child has a nightmare? Everyone hears it. Someone snores loudly. Everyone hears that too. A couple hoping for intimacy must... Chapter 5. Health, Hardship, and Resilience. The real cost of one room. Life in a one-room cottage may seem cozy from a distance, even charming. But the truth beneath that warm flicker of the hearth was far harsher. Families lived every day with a fragile balance between survival and disaster. A single accident, illness, or failed harvest could shatter the delicate world contained inside those four walls. The first and most constant threat was smoke. There was no chimney in most early cottages, just a hole in the thatched roof that sometimes let smoke escape. On calm days, the smoke curled upward and drifted out. But when wind blew downward or rain made the thatch heavy, smoke hung in the room, like a fog. Children coughed, eyes burned, lungs struggled, prolonged exposure led to chronic coughing, weakened lungs, and a shortened life expectancy. Yet families had no choice. The fire was essential for cooking, warmth, and light. It was life. Even as it quietly took years away, then came cold. Smoke and cold lived together like uneasy roommates. In winter, the cottage often hovered just above freezing, even with a strong fire burning. Drafts slipped through every crack in the walls. Frost crept across blankets. A spilled bucket of water could freeze solid overnight. Infants and the elderly suffered most. Many winters claimed both. Food scarcity was another ever-present danger. Even hard-working families could face hunger through no fault of their own. A crop blight, a harsh season, a neighbor's illness that required families to divide their stores. Life depended on weather, luck, and timing as much as it depended on effort. And when food ran low, meals grew thin. Turnip soup without turnips, porridge stretched with more water than grain. Parents often ate last, ensuring children got the most nourishment. But hunger wasn't the only invisible enemy. Disease lurked everywhere. In such tight quarters, illness passed from one person to the next with frightening speed. A simple fever could sweep through the entire household in days. There was no isolation, no spare room, no escape. If one child got sick, everyone else braced themselves. Simple cuts could become infected quickly. A burn from the hearth, a common injury, could turn deadly without herbs, honey, or clean bandages. The floor being dirt didn't help. Every step stirred up dust and bacteria. And then there were accidents. A toppled pot from the hearth. A tool dropped on a child's foot. A startled animal brought indoors during winter. Even the roof posed danger. Thatch was flammable, and a stray spark could turn an entire cottage into an inferno in minutes. Families lived with constant awareness of that risk. Fire brought life and threatened to take it away. Yet perhaps the greatest hardship was emotional exhaustion. Imagine never having a quiet place to sit, never having privacy, never being able to step away from noise, chores, or the needs of others. Parents carried an immense weight, not only feeding and sheltering their children, but doing so under conditions where everything felt fragile. Arguments happened often, stress boiled over, yet love persisted. Families learned to forgive quickly because there was simply no room, literally or emotionally, to stay angry for long. But within these hardships emerged remarkable resilience. Cottage families developed strength of body and mind that modern life rarely requires. They lived with constant uncertainty, yet found joy in small moments. The smell of bread baking, a healthy newborn goat, a warm evening with the family gathered close. They shared stories, laughter, and burdens. Children grew up with a deep understanding of responsibility. Parents carried wisdom, etched into their hands. Grandparents passed down heritage and memory as the fire crackled behind them. And through it all, the cottage held them together, sometimes painfully tight. Chapter 6. Why the one-room cottage disappeared, and what it teaches us today. For centuries, the one-room cottage wasn't just common. It was normal. It was the blueprint of life for millions of families across Europe, Asia, and beyond. But slowly, almost quietly, this way of living began to fade. By the time the modern era took shape, the one-room cottage had become a symbol of the past, replaced by homes with separate rooms, chimneys, proper kitchens, and walls that didn't leak wind. So what happened? How did this ancient way of living vanish, and why does it still matter today? The first spark of change came from something simple: technology. As tools improved, so did the ability to build stronger, larger homes. Iron nails replaced wooden pegs. Saws became sharper. Timber cutting became more efficient. Better roofing techniques meant fewer leaks and sturdier beams. Even small improvements allowed families to expand their homes slightly, adding a loft, a second room, or a small partition for privacy. Chimneys were revolutionary. They guided smoke upward and out, freeing families from the toxic haze that had filled their cottages for generations. With chimneys came hearths built into walls rather than the center of the room, making interior layouts more flexible. Suddenly, houses could be bigger without filling every space with smoke. But technological growth wasn't the only force at work. Agricultural change was equally powerful. As farming techniques improved, crop rotation, better plows, selective breeding of animals, yields increased. More food meant better health. Better health meant more labor. More labor meant more prosperity. Slowly, families gained the means to afford slightly larger homes. Communities changed too. Villages began working together, building mills, improving roads, and supporting trades like carpentry and masonry. With specialized craftsmen came houses that were no longer pieced together with whatever a family could find. They were built with skill, precision, and intention. Then came social change. As societies shifted from isolated rural life toward connected markets, trade expanded. People sold goods, bought tools, and learned new building methods from travelers, merchants, and neighbors. Privacy became a concept. something people began to desire, not as a luxury, but as a sign of dignity. Parents wanted separate sleeping spaces from their children. Young adults wanted their own corner. Even simple partitions made from fabric or wooden screens represented a step forward. And then, slowly but significantly, economics and opportunity transformed everything. The rise of towns and cities drew people away from their small cottages. Men became craftsmen, merchants, or laborers. Women found work in households or marketplaces. As families earned wages, instead of relying solely on crops, they gained the ability to pay rent, commission better homes, or build improved cottages back in their villages. Homes evolved from one-room shelters into symbols of stability. What once had been purely functional now carried emotional weight, pride, comfort, and a sense of rising status. By the Industrial Revolution, the one-room cottage had become outdated. Families demanded more space, more comfort, and more separation between life's many tasks. The cottage that once contained all of life, birth, meals, work, sleep, became too small for a world that was rapidly expanding. Yet despite its disappearance, the one-room cottage still teaches us something valuable. It reflects a time when families lived present in each other's lives, when conversations weren't interrupted by notifications, when entertainment was a story spoken aloud, not a screen, when survival depended not on convenience but on cooperation and the shared resilience of a household. It also reminds us how adaptable humans are, that even within the harshest conditions, cold winters, smoky air, limited space, people found ways to thrive, laugh, love, and build meaning.